Donc Judith va nous parler de son travail à Kennyland et à Communia, où elle a participé à l'élaboration du Public Domain Manifesto, qui préconise un meilleur accès au contenu culturel en Europe grâce à une compréhension plus large du domaine public et des exceptions de droits d'auteur plus généreuses, qui n'imposent pas de restrictions inutiles, notamment en ce qui concerne les usages pédagogiques. Over to you, Judith.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you to Katie and Martine for organizing this wonderful conference. Luckily, I can build a little bit further on my colleagues here who gave great presentations, and mine is quite in line, which is no surprise with theirs. So my name is Judith Blijden. I work as an advisor in copyright law and digital culture at Kennisland. Kennisland is based in Amsterdam. It's a Dutch think tank for social innovation. We work on a number of topics, not only copyright law, but also education, healthcare, and problems within the city. I really focus on improving access to and reuse of information and culture. Kennisland is also a member of Communia. Communia is a digital organization that advocates for policies that expand the public domain. We mostly focus at the moment on copyright reform within the European Union. Today I won't be talking as much about the copyright reform, even though I would love to, but I will focus on policy recommendations for cultural heritage institutions internally that you can do within your organization. But I will start and end with a look out. So I will start by elaborating a little bit on the underlying idea of why opening up is so important for cultural institutions and how we should perceive the relation between copyright and the digital public domain. So copyright, the legal right that grants the creator of an original work exclusive rights to determine whether and under what conditions that work may be used by others, has grown immensely over the last 100 years. Since the Berne Convention in 1886, when our modern copyright was formalized, new rights have been created, and the copyright term has been extended in most countries from 50 up to 70 or even 100 years after the death of the author. While copyright plays an important role as an incentive for innovation and creativity, copyright does not exist on its own. Copyright must always be balanced with the public interest, the right to information, freedom of speech, and other fundamental rights. While a book might be copyrighted, the knowledge within that book is not. So, Communia, our European association, aims to protect the public domain, and we elaborate on this principle in our Public Domain Manifesto, which we published quite some years ago, and are now signed by hundreds of organizations across the world. So the public domain, as we understand it, is the wealth of information that is free from barriers to access or reuse, usually associated with copyright protection, either because it is free from any copyright protection or because the rights holders have decided to remove these barriers. It is the raw material from which new knowledge is derived and new cultural works are created. So we also consider everything that falls within an exception or limitation as part of the public domain, and everything that has an open license as part of the public domain. So the balance between copyright on the one hand and the public interest can be illustrated by a beautiful quote of Victor Hugo. I'm a little bit uncomfortable in reading it out loud in front of an audience that is much better in French than I am, so feel free to read it yourself. The point is that we need to balance copyright against the public interest and recognize in what instances we should allow the public interest to go first. So today at this conference, where the main focus is on images that are part of public collections, deciding how to balance these interests, I think, is one of the most important issues to tackle, especially for cultural institutions who have a public mission. Mostly their core mission is to exhibit, promote, educate, and inform the public. They may be doing this by exhibiting individual works, paintings, manuscripts, or sculptures, but they're also doing this by giving the public access to our shared cultural heritage. not only by giving us access to individual works. Public institutions, often funded by public money with the aim to reach the public about our culture, should think about how they can provide the best access possible. In the 21st century, where we have the possibility to not only open our doors to let people in, but also reach out to people via the internet, we should grasp this possibility. The educative and informative function of cultural institutions can be accelerated by a good open policy, as we just saw from Karen's presentation, which is a wonderful example of this. Where possible and where appropriate, we should think about how to open collections, not only offline, but also online. So I think there are different layers on when you can become open. So obviously you start with copyright, which is closed initially, and then you have different degrees on how you can open your institution and different means of doing that. So you can either do that by individual or collective licenses. An institution can make agreements with, for instance, collective societies where they pay a general fee so that they can use and give access to works in their collection online. But you can go further and further once you go down this list. Of course, you can, if possible, use open licenses to give access to content, but there are also other means. While I really want to agree with my colleague that I think open licenses are really important in opening up, I also always try to emphasize that we also have other means of reaching a wider audience and opening up, such as exceptions and limitations that are often forgotten or dismissed because they can be very vague and it can be very unclear when they apply. It's still worth looking into how you can apply these exceptions and limitations to your work and to your situation, to your benefit, to reach a larger audience, for instance, schools or other people or researchers who might want to use works from your collection in their research. It's also good, I think, to realize that the public domain also consists out of things that have never been in copyright. This is also often forgotten. Facts, for instance, cannot be copyrighted, and they are part of the public domain. What I've also seen with collections that are opening up is that they get very enthusiastic and they start applying open licenses to all sorts of content, and then in that enthusiasm they also start applying open licenses to facts or to certain forms of data, which is good because the enthusiasm is good, but it's not good because it's completely incorrect and you cannot license a fact, luckily. So there are different layers and options of what you can do. And now, of course, is the question, how should you do this? And now I will come to my policy recommendations. So I think there are a couple of things you should consider. You should always contextualize your options. I give trainings to small cultural institutions in the Netherlands. For instance, this Friday I'm going to Nijverdal, which is a really small city in the east in the Netherlands, and I will talk to a small cultural institution that mostly exists of volunteers who work on the institution in their free time. So obviously I cannot go there and tell them that they need to have an entire coherent copyright policy in place and that they have to implement it in all facets of their organization. So what I do tell them is that they need to look at the resources, capacity, the type of institutions they are, the mission and objective of their institution, and their legal framework, and see what they can do. And when they thought about that, they can think about different things they can produce, different types of policies. They can think about how they communicate to users. They can create policy documents such as terms and conditions on how images, for instance, if they have a website, are to be used by users. They can think about technical infrastructure, for instance, using a Wikimedia Commons or some other type of platform to reach out to audience, and they should think about training of staff. For instance, what is very important is that often volunteers are the ones digitizing objects for cultural institutions, and it is very important that, for instance, these volunteers understand what they are doing and understand how they fit in with the larger strategy of the organization. And it's also important that if you have a rights strategy in place, that the entire organization is engaged. Having an open policy is not something that only concerns the legal person from an institution, but it concerns everything from the IT staff to the communication staff. And it's very good that it's very important that they are on the same page of what policies are in place and what that means for the different departments within the institution. Then I want to talk a little bit about risks. I think my fellow presenters didn't have time, so it's probably good for me to elaborate a bit on this. So I think we're still on a pioneering phase with opening up, and often the legal framework is unclear. So I wanted to give an example from the Netherlands where a cultural institution took a risk and it didn't really pay off, because that's also something that can happen. So Erfgoed Leiden, which is a cultural institution in Leiden, has a very large collection of mostly old photos, and mostly photos from Leiden, which is a small city. And these are like very old postcards from the 30s and 40s, or photos made by an individual that then came to the archive, passed through by the grandson of this individual. So these are not the normal kind of artworks you suspect in a larger museum, but these are more personal and in a familiar face. So they thought it was a very good idea to open up their collection to the public so that every citizen and every person within Leiden could see how Leiden looked like in the 30s and the 40s. This collection consisted out of hundreds and hundreds of photos that are mostly the photos that I just described, so old postcards, mostly from the 30s and the 40s. And they made an agreement with the collecting societies that they would pay a fee for the use of for the online publication of these photos on their website. So, and the collecting societies then would pay the authors, if there were any authors still alive, to make sure that no one was harmed by the online publication of this collection. Only there was one photographer who wasn't a member of the collecting societies in the Netherlands, which was also a conscious decision of this photographer, who was also an old photographer. He was, I think, over 70. And there were 5 photos in this collection of 100 of photos that were his, that he still had a copyright of. And in the end, in the court case, unfortunately for Erfgoed Leiden, they lost the case. They are going in appeal. And they had to pay quite a high amount of fee. And while this is a risk for cultural institutions to online publish their collections, I also want to applaud institutions like Erfgoed Leiden who take risks, because we really do need these kind of court cases to understand what the barriers are of what we can do. So even though I want to make you mindful of that there are risks that exist, I also want to motivate you a little bit to see how far you can go in order to serve the public interest. And obviously it's always a balance between the two. So I will round off. Then a third thing, often when I come to small cultural institutions in the Netherlands and I start talking about the Rijksmuseum, they roll their eyes because they're like, oh, we could never do such a thing as the Rijksmuseum. We're obviously very big pioneers in opening up. And the Rijksmuseum, again, I have another example of the Rijksmuseum because I do think that they are still, that we can still learn a lot from them. Last week they just announced that they will restore the Nachtwacht, the night watch, and they will do it openly, which means that you can go to the museum and see the restoration happening. And I think this is a very good example of how open can be more than just a policy recommendation or a policy in place in an institution, just a legal document. Opening up, I think, is an attitude of thinking how you can reach your audience in a better way. And I think this is a great example, and it's also for an accessible example, because I think other institutions could easily copy such forms of activities within their institution as well. And then I will yesterday there were already some things being said about the importance of open collections for research and education. So I will pass over this one. And then I will end briefly with a point about copyright reform. because, of course, as an institution, you need to adhere to the legal framework that is in place wherever you are. But there are also, when you are working quite a lot with opening up and open policies, you see that also the legal framework maybe should be improved to make it easier for cultural institutions to open up. And this is something we have been working on a lot. In 2016, European Commission proposed a new directive for copyright in the digital single market. It's now still being discussed within the 3 European institutions, the European Council, the Parliament, and the Commission, and we hope to see a final text near the end of the year or the beginning of next year. And within this text, a number of improvements of the European copyright copyright framework have been proposed that are very good, such as a text and data mining exception, an education exception for digital use of content, and different articles on cultural heritage preservation. And they also, well, they could still have been much better than they are right now, I think, but I'm still very happy with how they're probably going to look like. For instance, in the education exception that will be written in a new law, cultural heritage institutions will likely be recognized as educational establishments, so they will also be able to use this education exception just like schools could, so that's really good, I think. And we are still really fighting to make this as best as possible, because there are also some harmful articles in this directive that I will not talk about right now, not to ruin the mood. But the implementation will happen probably next year, so it will also be implemented in France. So as an institution that cares for open policies, I think it's really important to also care a little bit about copyright reform and see how you can influence the implementation in your own country for the benefits of cultural heritage. Thank you very much. I have some resources here because we have quite some guidelines on our website that really explain in detail how to open up. And we have a book coming up next year, which will also be available in French, which is a guide for opening up that we wrote for cultural institutions in Luxembourg. That's why it's also in French. So keep track on our website to learn more from there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you to the 3 of you, and I think something that's very clear is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that it's very much down to each institution to find the right policy for them. And I think it was someone at the Smithsonian who said, and much quoted, think big, start small, move fast. And I think this is very important. Bon, on va prendre des questions donc du public.
Thank you all for tremendously interesting presentations. This is a question that is primarily aimed at Judith, but the others may have comments too. I'm so interested in the copyright reform that's underway right now in the EU, and I'm just curious to know whether there's any attempt to try to harmonize some of the copyright exceptions that already exist. I think it's thrilling how much is happening in terms of sharing public domain information, no question. But of course there's a vast body of material that we might hope would fall under fair use, to use the American term. So I'd love to hear more about copyright exceptions across the EU and any attempt to find points of commonality that might be beneficial for cultural heritage institutions seeking to open up their treasure troves. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Is it on? Yeah. I guess the short answer is no, and the new directive, they won't be harmonizing any existing exceptions, which is a shame. It's something we really argued for, because Also, Kennisland made a website which is called copyrightexceptions.eu, which shows the fragmentation we have right now on the implementation of the exceptions that were written in the Information Society Directive. But we also made that website. It's a map, so it's an interactive map that you can click on any exception that is in the Information Society Directive to see whether it is implemented in all European member states. And if so, what the national code is of the implementation. And the map shows already that still some exceptions in the Information Society Directive have not been implemented at all in some countries. And it also shows that if they are implemented, they often are implemented in a very different scope and a very different way. So even though it might seem good that all the exceptions in some countries are implemented, they're still very different from each other. And that is a problem. What is good about the new directive is that it does propose new exceptions that are mandatory, which means that they will need to be implemented in the same way in every EU member state. That's the case for the education exception and for the text and data mining exception. So that's a very good. So in that sense, there's progress there in making it a little bit more harmonized, which would really help cultural institutions doing their job. So, yeah.
Also for Mrs. Blijden, about vocabulary problem. One of your slide was first copyright and last 8 public domain. And number 7, it was written faxed. And I don't understand really what it is. And in French we have fait, but I think it is a faux ami. So I prefer to ask you.
I don't think I think it's the right translation. Facts. Just maybe someone French can help me with the French translation.
It's a known thing.
Yeah.
So if like when an artist was born, you cannot copyright that on the museum's website because it's a fact. This is something people know. It's not your work.
Maybe I can give an example. For instance, for especially institutions that work on archaeological artifacts, they often map what stone was found where. For instance, that information is a fact, for instance.
Il y a une question là.
Bonjour, my name is Dorian Cellier. I'm involved in the Heritage Data Reuse Charter. I don't know if you're familiar with that. First of all, are all your great presentations, are you going to share them online? Somewhere? Oh, okay, nice. Thank you for that. And second, maybe more towards Roxanne, it's about rights management strategy. Do you think it's important for cultural heritage institutions to have a rights management strategy towards the enrichment of the collections that can happen from researchers if they use their collections? Do you think it's important? Is there any initiative towards that direction? The enrichment of digital collections, metadata, first of all. Thank you.
Thank you for your, is this on? This on? Yeah, thank you for your question. I think I agree it's important. I do think it's important. I think what it will come down to is often institutions' priorities in terms of fitting that within a rights management strategy. And I think when you're enriching that data, it's also this fine, sometimes subjective line between what is fact and what is you kind of adding your kind of implied knowledge, if that makes sense. But so it's balancing those interests. I think it's something that definitely needs to be part of a strategy. I don't think it's something that's just not relevant, but it's where it fits in and how that is addressed that I think is quite unknown at the moment. I don't know if Karen has any experience of dealing with that side of things.
You mean dealing with putting the enrichment of data from the research side? Yeah. Well, the thing is that there's an internal policy that we think that certain certain fields in the collection database should be filled to reach a certain status, but there's no initiative, as far as I know, that aims to streamline that across institutions. So we're discussing that in between museums a bit in Sweden, but I mean it's a small country.
Thank you very much for your presentations. It was extremely stimulating. I have very specific questions, or in fact, 2 specific questions to Roxanne Peters. I was extremely interested in your experience at the V&A, and I wanted to know, well, today in the museums in France at least, the main point, and one of the main points in strategic development is the conquest for new audiences, people that are usually out of the box, but are out of the museum's fields. And I'd love to know if the different actions that you've developed helped also not only to work with researchers and develop relationships with other institutions that are museums or libraries, or in fact are GLAMs, but also to have a new development in new audiences. That's the first thing. Do you have like really concrete examples? And the second thing is about a very specific point, the Balenciaga show that you told us about. I was interested in the fact that students of art schools could redo things, but most of the examples that we saw today are related to the right of images. But there is also, in that very specific example, a question about not only the image, but the process. How do you make this kind of dresses? How do you make this kind of fabrics? And this is not a right to image, but of knowledge of the things. Was this a very specific or other problem that you had to face? What kind of solutions did you develop to do it? And what were the relationships between the V&A and Balenciaga on that very specific point? Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll try and... So your first question was in relation to sort of reaching new audiences that might not have kind of been on site before. Again, I think it comes back to increasingly with our strategy, there's been a real, not surprisingly, emphasis on digital in the broadest sense, and what that means in practice is still, I think, again, evolving. And so I think there has been kind of an emphasis on kind of looking at funded research projects and collaboration to look at areas of the collections that might not have been accessed before. And that has come about, so it's not just kind of museum outwards, but others contacting the museum. So it's having that kind of two-way exchange and making sure that it's not just all from within, and it's the museum interpreting how things should be and how things should be done in that way. And then, like the example I just gave, the 3D printed example is from something that's part of the redevelopment of a specific gallery. So I think the way that it's tended to work in terms of strategy is looking at programming, digital priorities, and kind of working kind of in a kind of interdisciplinary way, and also working across. For one organisation, as you can maybe imagine, it's actually quite can be quite decentralised. So I think it's been identifying those priorities based on having this joined up thinking to achieve that end goal. For the Balenciaga example, I think that just was really I was very mindful that we're talking mainly about access to sort of open access to images, but I think because I was talking about developing a right strategy, I think I was, if I'd have more time to emphasise as well, it's kind of, you can have the same content, the same cultural content, and it's really reinforcing to your internal stakeholders that there's lots of different ways to use the same content. It's not, as Katie said, a one-size-fits-all, and that will then include how you build relationships with internal and external stakeholders. And with Balenciaga, it very much came down to thinking about that end goal, that exhibition, but beyond the exhibition, the online visibility, ongoing work with the students. This idea, this thing you mentioned about copying, that's one of the big challenges with rights, is that fine line between imitation or inspiration and imitation. And I think that really, for an institution like the V&A with the diverse collections that it has, was one of the areas that I spent a lot of time kind of advising and sort of navigating with my colleagues on what, you know, we're there to provide access, to inspire, to, you know, that's how copyright law works, to kind of get this balance of interest. The practice can be quite different sometimes. So I think Balenciaga is a good example just to share with you of how understanding the rights and managing these different relationships at different stages of the project ensured that kind of access, success. I hope that's answered your question. Okay.
Yes, hello. I have two questions for Karin. First of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting. And I have a question about metadata. And of course, it was very interesting that you pointed out that that's important as well. Very practical question. When you send in to the world images with metadata, what do you do if an attribution of an artwork changes? It is very easy to change it all over. And my second question is concerning the risks you mentioned very briefly. Are that the same risks that Judith told about claims, or are there any other risks at all?
So first of all, the answer to the first question is as we might assume, unfortunately, no. So it's not very easy because as the technical infrastructure looks right now, most portals work with exports that are shown somewhere else. So this is true for Europeana, and it's also true for our Wikidata data, that this is something we gave to this portal at one time, and it looks like that until we updated it. We have a reasonably easy way to send out new exports, and we do that in regular amounts of time. But generally, we're of the opinion that because the important thing is that the resources always point back to the source. So it's still the museum website that people go to if they want the reliable information. So, and that's why I pointed out the Wikipedia collaboration so much, because Wikipedia is an entry point into knowledge. But if people get more interested, if they want to dive deeper, what's so great about it is that all the sources are listed there. And if you get interested into the images, you will be pointed directly to our museum website, where you will then find updated information, if that's the point. And the second question about the risks. Of course, there are risks, the same risk that Judith pointed out, because when we sort of don't claim our copyright anymore and put the images in the public domain, we have a very severe problem right now, which is that the public domain is not protected as such to an extent that it should be. So somebody else could actually put the image on his or her server and say, like, oh, you can buy this from me for €5. They cannot put a watermark on it or something like that, but there are situations where people find their way around it, and it's just to live with it. For us, the solution is to make sure that people find our images before they find anybody else's, and so for that, this risk is kind of reasonable as well. Then, of course, there might be well, for us, what I didn't say is that the public domain mark that we put on the images, of course, only applies to works of art that are of 2 dimensions and where the original work of art already is in the public domain. So like the survey that Douglas pointed out, it's not about any work of art that in itself still has a copyright. So we don't think that there's a huge risk of any claims coming, but you never really know. I would like to add something that Katie said, and I would like to remind you that this really big publicity that we got with our open licensing policy was when we gave 3,000 images to Wikimedia Commons. We have a collection of 600,000 works of art. So it's really, you can really start very small. And before people get worked up about all the risks, like Roxanne pointed out that there might be pockets of collections where it's kind of complicated, and we have all those cases. It's just that you don't need to solve all those problems before you start, but you can always, every museum can find a little collection with, say, 100 or 200 assets where there's no risk at all, and start with that and see where it takes you.
On va prendre une toute dernière question.
Sorry, it is again about the same slide. Maybe can we show the,
Yeah, sure.
because the sixth one was information. Okay, so what is the difference between information and facts? And with maybe also more than facts, the word specific circumstances will be better.
It's not an easy question, but information, for instance, if you have a book that says, that tells a story about the Second World War, the book itself obviously is copyright protected, but the information about the events that happened during the World War is information about the Second World War. That's what I mean with information. So for instance, as a museum that mostly has a lot of Second World War works, you can still tell the information that is within your collection without any barriers, but you cannot always give access to each individual work that is copyright protected. Is that clear?
And the meaning of specific circumstances will be in what item, in what point of the it?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
You have explained about archaeological artifacts were found
Yes.
at that time, and you said that is a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And where will you place special circumstances? About the way to find this artifact archaeological, for instance, what is preventive or not? You know what I mean? So, well, maybe I will ask you.
Yes, sure.
One to one.
Yeah, maybe given the time, we could continue the conversation afterwards. Donc, merci à nos trois intervenants. Beaucoup, c'était très, très intéressant comme session. Et je vous invite à revenir à 14h pile pour démarrer les deux sessions très riches qui nous attendent cet après-midi.